The mahogany-paneled walls of my father's corner office in downtown Chicago had witnessed countless business deals worth millions, but they had never seen anything quite like what I was about to deliver. As I clutched the sealed envelope from Harvard University, my hands trembling slightly, I could still hear his voice echoing from 3 years ago. Philosophy? Maya, you might as well have majored in underwater basket weaving. That degree won't even get you a job at Starbucks. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Today, those words would come back to haunt him. The autumn leaves crunched beneath my feet as I walked across the Northwestern University campus, my worn leather messenger bag slung over my shoulder, heavy with philosophy texts that most people considered abstract nonsense. It was October 2021, my senior year, and while my classmates worried about job interviews and graduate school applications, I carried a different weight, the constant disapproval of a father who saw my chosen field as an elaborate waste of his money. Dr. Elena Vasquez adjusted her reading glasses as she handed back our midterm papers on Kantian ethics. The red ink on mine was minimal, and the A+ at the top made my chest swell with quiet pride. After class, she asked me to stay behind. Maya, your analysis of the categorical imperative was exceptional, she said, settling into her chair. Have you considered pursuing a PhD? Your work has the kind of depth that could make a real impact in academic philosophy. I shifted uncomfortably. My father thinks philosophy is a dead-end field. He's been pushing me toward business school since freshman year. Dr. Vasquez leaned forward, her expression serious. Maya, I've been teaching for 23 years. Students like you come along maybe once in a decade. Your paper on moral epistemology last semester, I shared it with colleagues at Harvard and Yale. They were impressed. The weight of her words settled over me, but even as excitement bubbled up, I felt the familiar knot of anxiety in my stomach. My father, Richard Chen, had built Chen Industries from a small import business into a multinational corporation worth over $800 million. To him, success was measured in quarterly reports and stock prices, not in the philosophical implications of human consciousness or the nature of ethical reasoning. That evening, I sat in the study of our Winnetka mansion, surrounded by the first edition business books my father collected like trophies. The house itself was a monument to material success: 12,000 square feet of Italian marble, crystal chandeliers, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of Lake Michigan. Every room whispered the same message. This is what matters. This is what success looks like. My father entered the room without knocking, a habit that had annoyed me since childhood. At 58, Richard Chen commanded attention wherever he went. His tailored suits never showed a wrinkle. His silver hair was always perfectly styled, and his dark eyes seemed to calculate the monetary value of everything they saw. Maya, we need to discuss your post-graduation plans, he said, settling into the leather chair across from my desk. I've arranged an interview with Goldman Sachs for next month. If that doesn't work out, there's always a position waiting for you at Chen Industries. I looked up from my copy of Wittgenstein's Philosophical Investigations, my finger marking the page I'd been analyzing. Dad, I've told you before, I'm not interested in finance or business. I'm planning to apply to philosophy graduate programs. His laugh was sharp and dismissive, the same sound he made when competitors tried to lowball him in negotiations. Philosophy graduate programs? Maya, listen to yourself. You're 21 years old and you're talking about extending your childhood for another 6 years. When do you plan to start your real life? This is my real life, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Philosophy isn't just abstract thinking, Dad. It's about understanding fundamental questions that shape how we live, how we make decisions, how we structure society. How do we structure society? He stood up, pacing to the window. Maya, society is structured by economics, by power, by practical realities. not by academic theories that have no bearing on the real world. I closed my book, frustration rising in my chest. Just because something isn't immediately profitable doesn't mean it's worthless. He turned back to me, his expression a mixture of disappointment and barely controlled anger. Worthless? Let me tell you what's worthless. Spending 4 years I've paid for, studying questions that have no answers and problems, that have no solutions. Do you know what your philosophy degree qualifies you for? Teaching other people to ask the same pointless questions. The words stung, but I'd heard variations of them for years. Dr. Vasquez thinks I could make real contributions to the field. She mentioned that professors at Harvard and Yale were interested in my work. Harvard? He scoffed. Maya, anyone can impress a professor with clever writing. But can you impress a client? Can you close a deal? Can you manage a budget? Can you do anything that creates actual value in the world? I felt tears threatening, but I forced them back. Not everything valuable can be measured in dollars, Dad. Everything valuable absolutely can be measured in dollars, he replied coldly. That's what value means, what people are willing to pay for something. And no one pays for philosophical speculation. He moved toward the door, then paused. I'm going to make this very simple for you, Maya. You can continue this philosophy hobby while you're at Northwestern. I've already paid the tuition, but after graduation, you have 6 months to find a real job. If you haven't, you'll come work for me, and you'll start from the bottom like everyone else. After he left, I sat in silence, staring at the books that filled the shelves around me. They were all business texts. The Art of the Deal, Good to Great, The Lean Startup. Not a single work of philosophy among them. In this house, in this family, there was no room for the questions that fascinated me, no value placed on the kind of thinking that made me feel most alive. The next morning, I called Dr. Vasquez and asked if we could meet. Her office in University Hall was the opposite of my father's, cluttered with books, papers, and coffee mugs, the walls covered with philosophical quotes and pictures of her former students. It felt like a sanctuary. I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, I began, settling into the chair across from her desk. About Harvard and Yale being interested in my work. She smiled. I wasn't exaggerating, Maya. Professor Jonathan Blackwood at Harvard specifically asked about you. After reading your paper on consciousness and moral responsibility, he's one of the most respected philosophers in the country. My heart raced. Would he consider mentoring a graduate student? More than consider, she said, pulling out a folder. He's actually part of a new research initiative at Harvard, the Institute for Applied Ethics and Consciousness Studies. They're looking for exceptional graduate students to join their program. She handed me a printed email. As I read, my eyes widened. The program wasn't just about abstract philosophical research. It involved working with neuroscientists, psychologists, and even AI researchers to understand how ethical decision-making actually worked in the human brain. It was philosophy with real-world applications, exactly the kind of work that might bridge the gap between my passion and my father's demands for practical relevance. This is incredible, I whispered. But the competition must be fierce. It is, Dr. Vasquez admitted. They're only accepting 3 students in the inaugural class. But Maya, your work on the intersection of Kantian ethics and modern cognitive science is exactly what they're looking for. You've been developing these ideas since sophomore year, ideas that most graduate students don't encounter until their dissertations. I thought about my father's ultimatum, about his dismissive laughter, about the way he'd reduced my life's passion to a hobby. Dr. Vasquez, if I were to be accepted into this program, would there be funding? Her smile widened. Full funding, stipend, health insurance, research budget, and Maya. Here's the part that might interest your family. Professor Blackwood mentioned that graduates from this program are being recruited by major corporations, government agencies, even tech companies. They need people who can navigate the ethical implications of artificial intelligence, biotechnology, data privacy. For the first time in months, I felt a surge of hope. Maybe there was a way to honor both my passion and my father's practical concerns. Maybe I could prove that philosophy wasn't just abstract navel-gazing, but a field with real applications and real value. That afternoon, I began working on my application to Harvard's program. The personal statement was the most important part, and I poured everything into it: my love for philosophical inquiry, my frustration with the perceived irrelevance of academic philosophy, and my vision for how rigorous ethical thinking could address the most pressing problems of the 21st century. I wrote about the ethical implications of artificial intelligence, about how companies like my father's would soon need philosophers to help navigate questions of algorithmic bias, data privacy, and automated decision-making. I wrote about the intersection of neuroscience and moral psychology, and how understanding the biological basis of ethical reasoning could revolutionize everything from criminal justice to education policy. As I worked, I could hear my father, on a conference call in his office down the hall, his voice rising and falling as he negotiated some complex deal. The language was all numbers and timelines, metrics and deliverables. It was a language I understood but had never loved. But in my personal statement, I was speaking my own language, the language of ideas and implications, of questions that mattered more than their immediate practical applications. For the first time in years, I felt like I was being completely honest about who I was and what I wanted from life. Over the following weeks, I threw myself into the application process. Letters of recommendation from Dr. Vasquez and 2 other professors, official transcripts, GRE scores that were nearly perfect thanks to years of analytical training. But the centerpiece was a writing sample, a 30-page paper I'd been working on for months about the ethical frameworks needed to govern artificial general intelligence. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now back to where we left off. The paper argued that as AI systems became more sophisticated, we would need philosophers working alongside computer scientists to ensure that these systems were aligned with human values. It wasn't abstract theorizing, it was practical philosophy for the most important technological challenge of our time. My father remained skeptical. At dinner one evening in November, as I excitedly told him about the Harvard program, he listened with the polite attention he usually reserved for boring business presentations. "So let me understand this," he said, cutting into his salmon. "You want to spend 6 years getting a PhD so you can think about robot ethics?" "It's more complex than that, Dad. We're on the verge of creating artificial intelligence that could transform society. Someone needs to think deeply about the implications." "Someone? Yes. But why does that someone need to be you?" He set down his fork. "Maya, tech companies have lawyers. They have compliance departments. They don't need philosophers." "Actually, they do," I said, my voice gaining confidence. "Google has a whole AI ethics team. So does Microsoft. Facebook, Meta, has been hiring philosophers to work on algorithmic bias." He looked genuinely surprised. "They hire philosophers? To do what, exactly?" "To ask the right questions, to think through consequences that engineers might miss, to help design systems that are fair, transparent, and beneficial." For a moment, I saw something flicker in his eyes. Not approval exactly, but curiosity. The businessman in him was intrigued by the idea of companies paying philosophers. And what do they pay for these philosophical consultants? I had done my research. Starting salaries at major tech companies for people with philosophy PhDs can be $150,000 to $200,000. Senior positions can reach $300,000 or more. He was quiet for a long moment. "That's more than I expected." "Dad, the world is changing. the questions that philosophers have been asking for centuries, about consciousness, about moral responsibility, about the nature of knowledge, these aren't just academic anymore. They're becoming practical problems that real companies need to solve. I could see him processing this information, his business mind calculating possibilities. For the first time, he seemed to be taking my career aspirations seriously. But then, his expression hardened again. Maya, even if everything you're saying is true, you're still talking about a very narrow field with limited opportunities. What happens if you spend 6 years getting this degree and the AI ethics bubble bursts? What happens if companies decide they don't need philosophers after all? The question hit at my deepest fears. What if I was wrong? What if I was betting my future on a field that might not exist in 10 years? I guess that's a risk I'm willing to take, I said quietly. Well, I'm not, he replied firmly. Maya, I've built a successful business by making smart bets, not by chasing academic fads. My offer stands. 6 months after graduation to find a real job. Or you come work for me. As winter settled over Chicago, I continued working on my Harvard application while watching my classmates stress about job interviews and post-graduation plans. Many of them envied my safety net, the guaranteed position at Chen Industries if nothing else worked out. They didn't understand that what looked like security felt more like a trap. The application deadline was December 15th. I submitted everything 3 days early, then began the agonizing wait for a response. Harvard's philosophy department only notified applicants in March, which meant 4 months of uncertainty, 4 months of my father's skeptical looks and pointed questions about backup plans. During winter break, I tried to enjoy the holidays, but the tension with my father colored every interaction. At the annual Chen Industries Christmas party, held in the ballroom of the Palmer House Hotel, I watched him work the room with his characteristic confidence. Clients, employees, and business partners all sought his attention, hanging on his words as he discussed market trends and expansion plans. I stood at the edge of the room, nursing a glass of champagne and feeling like an outsider in my own family's world. This was the life my father wanted for me, a world of deals and networking, of quarterly profits and shareholder meetings. It wasn't that I looked down on it. I could see the skill and intelligence it required. But it wasn't me. Maya, a voice, called out behind me. I turned to see James Wu, one of my father's vice presidents and a family friend since I was a child. How's your senior year going? Ready to join the family business? I managed a smile. Actually, I'm applying to graduate school, philosophy PhD programs. His eyebrows shot up. Philosophy? Wow, that's unexpected. What kind of career prospects does that have? Before I could answer, my father appeared beside us, having overheard the conversation. That's what I keep asking her, he said with a chuckle. But apparently, Maya thinks companies will start hiring philosophers to, what was it? Think about robot feelings? The dismissive tone in his voice made my cheeks burn. James laughed politely, but I could see the confusion in his eyes. In their world, the idea of studying philosophy for 6 years seemed as foreign as deciding to become a professional juggler. Actually, I said, my voice steadier than I felt, I'm applying to work on AI ethics and consciousness studies. There's a growing field of applied philosophy that addresses real-world problems. Applied philosophy, my father repeated, as if the words didn't quite make sense together. Maya, when something is truly applied, we don't call it philosophy anymore. We call it engineering, or medicine, or law. The conversation moved on to safer topics. The latest Cubs season, plans for New Year's Eve, speculation about the stock, market. But I felt my father's words echoing in my mind for the rest of the evening. Was he right? Was I just dressing up abstract theorizing in practical language to make myself feel better about my choices? That night, alone in my childhood bedroom surrounded by philosophy books and Harvard application materials, I questioned everything. Maybe my father was right. Maybe I was naive to think that the questions that fascinated me could translate into a meaningful career. Maybe I was just an idealistic kid who would eventually have to face the practical realities of the adult world. But then I thought about Dr. Vasquez's words, about Professor Blackwood's interest in my work, about the growing field of AI ethics and the real problems that philosophers were being hired to solve. I thought about the paper I'd written on consciousness and moral responsibility, and how it had sparked discussions that seemed to matter, that seemed to address questions that would only become more important as technology advanced. I couldn't know if I'd get into Harvard. I couldn't know if the field of applied philosophy would continue to grow. But I knew that giving up now, accepting my father's vision of what my life should be, would mean abandoning the part of myself that felt most authentic and alive. The waiting game continued through January and February. My father's attitude toward my graduate school applications remained skeptical, but I noticed him occasionally asking questions about the field, about what philosophers actually did in tech companies, about the practical applications of ethical reasoning. It was as if part of him wanted to understand, even as another part dismissed the whole enterprise as academic folly. Meanwhile, I threw myself into my senior thesis, an analysis of how different ethical frameworks might be embedded into artificial intelligence systems. The work was challenging and absorbing, requiring me to bridge philosophy with computer science, cognitive psychology, and neuroscience. It was exactly the kind of interdisciplinary thinking that Professor Blackwood's program at Harvard was designed to foster. As March approached, my anxiety about the Harvard decision reached a fever pitch. This wasn't just about graduate school. It was about proving to my father and to myself that my chosen path had value and potential. It was about validating 4 years of study that he had funded while considering it a waste of money. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was desperate for approval from a man whose values I disagreed with, whose vision of success felt narrow and materialistic. But he was still my father, and despite our differences, I wanted him to be proud of me. I wanted him to see that the daughter he'd raised could be successful in her own way, on her own terms. Little did I know that in just a few weeks, everything would change in ways I never could have imagined. March arrived in Chicago with its usual fickleness, snow one day, unseasonably warm sunshine the next. I checked my email obsessively, refreshing my inbox every few minutes even though I knew Harvard's decisions wouldn't come until later in the month. My father's 6-month ultimatum loomed like a storm cloud, and graduation was only 2 months away. The spring career fair at Northwestern felt like walking through a parallel universe where everyone spoke a different language. Students in crisp business attire clustered around booths for McKinsey, Goldman Sachs, and Google, clutching resumes that listed internships at Fortune 500 companies and leadership positions in pre-professional clubs. I wandered through the maze of corporate displays, my philosophy degree feeling increasingly abstract and impractical. At the Google booth, I struck up a conversation with a recruiter named Sarah Martinez. She was probably in her early 30s, with the kind of confident energy that suggested she'd found her place in the world. "Philosophy major?" she said, glancing at my resume. "That's interesting. We don't see many of those." "I'm particularly interested in AI ethics," I explained, launching into my well-rehearsed pitch about the intersection of philosophical reasoning and technological development. Her expression shifted from polite interest to genuine curiosity. "Actually, that's incredibly relevant. Our AI principles team has been expanding rapidly. Have you heard about our work on responsible AI development?" For the next 20 minutes, we discussed algorithmic bias, the alignment problem in artificial intelligence, and the philosophical frameworks needed to ensure that AI systems reflected human values. It was the kind of conversation I'd dreamed of having in a professional context. Deep, meaningful, intellectually stimulating. "I'm going to give you the contact information for Dr. Amanda Chen. No relation, I assume?" She smiled at my shake of the head. She leads our AI ethics research. She has a PhD in philosophy from Stanford and might be interested in talking with you about opportunities. As I walked away from the booth, I felt a surge of validation. This was real. Companies like Google weren't just hiring philosophers as an academic curiosity. They needed the kind of thinking that my degree had trained me to do. That evening, I excitedly told my father about the encounter over dinner. We were eating in the formal dining room, a vast space with a chandelier that could have graced a small ballroom. The table could seat 12, but it was just the two of us, my mother having passed away when I was 16. So this recruiter thinks, "There might be opportunities in AI ethics?" he asked, cutting his steak with surgical precision. "More than opportunities, Dad." She said it's a rapidly expanding field. Companies are realizing they need people who can think through the ethical implications of their technology. He was quiet for a moment, chewing thoughtfully. "Maya, I've learned to be suspicious of rapidly expanding fields. They have a tendency to expand right up until the moment they disappear entirely." The comment stung, but I pressed on. "This isn't a fad, Dad. As AI becomes more powerful and more prevalent, the ethical questions become more urgent. Someone needs to address them. And you think that someone should be you?" His tone wasn't entirely dismissive. There was something else there, a note I couldn't quite identify. "I think I'm well prepared for it. My thesis advisor says my work on consciousness and moral responsibility could make a real contribution to the field." "Your thesis advisor." He set down his fork. "Maya, I want you to understand something about the academic world. Professors live in a bubble. They're rewarded for finding problems to think about, not for solving problems that actually exist. The questions that fascinate them might have no bearing on the real world." I felt my frustration rising. "Dad, you keep talking about the real world as if ideas don't matter. But ideas shape everything. The ethical principles that guide how we treat employees, how we design products, how we structure society, those all come from philosophical thinking." "No," he said firmly. "Those come from practical experience, from trial and error, from market forces. Philosophy might describe them after the fact, but it doesn't create them." The conversation ended in the familiar stalemate that had characterized our discussions for months. But as I went to bed that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted in my father's tone. The outright dismissal was still there, but underneath it, I sensed something like concern. Not just about my career prospects, but about something deeper. The next morning, I found him in his home office, door open, speaking on the phone in rapid Mandarin. My Chinese was rusty, but I caught enough to understand he was discussing a potential acquisition in Shanghai. When he finished the call, I knocked on the doorframe. "Dad? Do you have a minute?" He gestured to the chair across from his desk. "What's on your mind?" I took a deep breath. "I want to understand why you're so opposed to my studying philosophy. Is it really just about career prospects?" He leaned back in his chair, studying me with an expression I couldn't read. "Maya, do you know why I came to America?" The question caught me off guard. My father rarely talked about his early life in Taiwan, his immigration to the United States, the years of struggle before Chen Industries became successful. "For opportunities," I said. "To build a better life." "For certainty," he corrected. In Taiwan, I was at the mercy of forces I couldn't control: political instability, economic uncertainty, family expectations that had nothing to do with my abilities or interests. When I came here, I was 25 years old with $500 and a degree in engineering that American companies didn't recognize. I'd heard fragments of this story before, but never in this context, never with this intensity. I worked construction jobs, restaurant kitchens, anything that would pay. And you know what I learned? That survival depends on skills that other people value enough to pay for. Not skills that are interesting or intellectually satisfying, but skills that solve problems people actually have. He stood and walked to the window that looked out over Lake Michigan. I built Chen Industries by identifying what people needed and figuring out how to provide it better and cheaper than anyone else. Every decision I made was grounded in practical reality. But Dad, I said carefully, wasn't there also vision involved? Imagination? The ability to see possibilities that others missed? He turned back to me, and for a moment his expression softened. Yes. But those possibilities had to be grounded in something real, something measurable. When I decided to expand into electronics importing, I didn't do it because I found electronics philosophically interesting. I did it because I saw a gap in the market. I was beginning to understand something about his opposition to my chosen field, something that went deeper than simple practicality. You think philosophy is a luxury that only people with safety nets can afford. I think, he said slowly, that philosophy is what people do when they don't have to worry about real problems. When you're struggling to pay rent, you don't spend time contemplating the nature of consciousness. When you're trying to build a business, you don't debate different ethical frameworks. You do what works. The words hung in the air between us. I understood now that his dismissal of my academic interests wasn't just about money or career prospects. It was about a fundamental difference in how we saw the world and our place in it. But Dad, I said, what if the problems philosophy addresses are real problems? What if thinking deeply about consciousness matters because we're about to create artificial minds? What if ethical frameworks matter because technology is giving us unprecedented power to shape society? He was quiet for a long time, looking out at the lake. Maya, I've spent 30 years building something solid, something that can't be dismissed, or defunded or declared irrelevant by academic fashion. I want the same security for you. Security, I repeated. But what about fulfillment? What about using your abilities to address the problems that matter most to you? Fulfillment, he said, is what happens when you have the luxury of choice. First, you build security. Then you can think about fulfillment. Our conversation was interrupted by his phone ringing, another business call, another practical problem that needed his immediate attention. But as I left his office, I felt like I understood him better than I had in years. His opposition to my career plans wasn't just about philosophy, it was about fear. Fear that I would struggle the way he had, that I would waste my advantages, pursuing something that might not provide the security he'd worked so hard to build. Over the following days, I found myself thinking about our conversation as I worked on my senior thesis. The paper I was writing argued that ethical reasoning was becoming increasingly important in a world shaped by powerful technologies. But my father's words echoed in my mind. Was I addressing real problems, or was I just finding sophisticated ways to think about abstract issues? I decided to test my ideas in the most practical way I could imagine. I reached out to Dr. Amanda Chen at Google, the AI ethics researcher that Sarah Martinez had mentioned. To my surprise, she responded within hours and suggested a phone call. Dr. Chen had a warm voice with a slight accent I couldn't place. Sarah mentioned you're working on consciousness and moral responsibility. That's fascinating. It's exactly the kind of philosophical grounding we need in AI development. Really? I couldn't hide my excitement. My father thinks philosophy is too abstract to have practical applications, she laughed. I get that reaction all the time. People think philosophy is just academic navel-gazing until they're trying to design an AI system that makes fair decisions. Then suddenly questions about the nature of fairness and moral reasoning become very practical very quickly. We talked for over an hour about the challenges facing AI development, the philosophical questions that were becoming urgent business concerns, and the growing need for people who could bridge the gap between abstract ethical reasoning and concrete technological implementation. Maya, she said as our conversation was winding down, Would you be interested in a summer internship? We're launching a new research project on AI consciousness and moral reasoning. It sounds like your thesis work would be directly relevant. Heart leaped. Absolutely. What would the internship involve? Working with our AI principles team to develop frameworks for ensuring that artificial intelligence systems can make ethical decisions. It's exactly the kind of applied philosophy you've been studying. After the call ended, I sat in my room staring at my phone in amazement. This was it. Proof that my academic interests had real-world applications, that companies were willing to pay philosophers to address practical problems. I couldn't wait to tell my father, but when I found him that evening and excitedly shared the news about the Google internship, his response was more muted than I'd hoped. "That's interesting," he said. "What exactly would you be doing?" "Developing ethical frameworks for AI systems. Making sure artificial intelligence makes decisions that align with human values." He nodded slowly. "And this is a paid internship?" "Yes. Actually, it pays quite well. $8,000 a month." His eyebrows rose slightly. $8,000 a month for an intern? To think about robot ethics? To develop practical solutions to ethical problems. In AI development, I corrected. "Dad, this is exactly what I've been talking about. Philosophy isn't just abstract theorizing anymore. It's becoming essential for technology companies." He was quiet for a moment, processing this information. "Maya, I'm glad you found an internship, but you need to understand. Summer internships don't necessarily lead to permanent positions. And even if they do, you're still talking about a very specialized field with limited opportunities." The familiar frustration rose in my chest. Nothing I said seemed to convince him that my chosen path had real potential. "Dad, what would it take for you to take my career plans seriously?" He looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Results," he said finally. "Not promises or possibilities or academic praise. Real results that demonstrate real value." As March progressed toward its end, I found myself caught between two worlds. At Northwestern, I was surrounded by professors and fellow students who validated my academic interests and encouraged my graduate school aspirations. But at home, I faced constant skepticism from the person whose approval I most wanted. The tension came to a head one evening when I received an email that made my heart stop. Harvard's decision letter had arrived, not in my inbox, but in the university's online portal. My hands shook as I logged in, afraid to look but unable to stop myself. The first word I saw was, "Congratulations." I had been accepted to Harvard's PhD program in philosophy, with full funding and a research assistantship with Professor Jonathan Blackwood. More than that, I had been selected as one of only 3 students for the new Institute for Applied Ethics and Consciousness Studies. For several minutes, I sat staring at the screen, unable to process what I was reading. Everything I'd worked, for everything I'd dreamed of, it was real. Harvard wanted me. Professor Blackwood wanted to work with me. The field I'd been passionate about was opening its doors, but as the initial euphoria began to fade, I thought about my father's ultimatum, his skepticism, his insistence that philosophy had no practical value. How would I tell him about this? Opportunity? How would I convince him that this was the path I needed to take? I printed out the acceptance letter and walked downstairs to find him. He was in the living room, reading the Wall Street Journal and listening to a jazz album I'd given him for his birthday years ago. "Dad," I said, my voice barely steady, "I need to show you something." He looked up from his newspaper, taking in my expression. "What is it, Maya?" I handed him the letter. "I got into Harvard." He read it slowly, his face showing no emotion. "When?" He finished. He set it down on the coffee table between us. "Congratulations," he said quietly. "This is what you wanted." "Yes," I said. "It is." He was silent for a long time, staring at the letter as if it might change what it said. 6 years, he finally said. 6 years of graduate school, living on a student stipend, postponing your real career. Dad, this is my real career. This is exactly what I want to do with my life. He stood up and walked to the window, his back to me. Maya, I need you to understand something. This letter doesn't change anything. Academic success and real-world success are different things. I've seen brilliant people waste years pursuing academic dreams that led nowhere. The words hit me like a physical blow. Here I was, holding acceptance to one of the most prestigious PhD programs in the country, and he was treating it like a consolation prize. Nowhere? I said, my voice rising. Dad, Harvard is not nowhere. Professor Blackwood is one of the most respected philosophers in the world. The Institute for Applied Ethics is doing groundbreaking work that will shape how society deals with artificial intelligence. Maya? He turned back to me, his expression pained. I'm not trying to hurt you. I'm trying to protect you from disappointment. The academic world makes promises it can't keep. It tells students they're special, that their work matters, that they're preparing for important careers. But most of them end up teaching introductory courses at community colleges or leaving academia altogether. So you want me to turn down Harvard? You want me to give up on the field I'm passionate about because you're afraid I might fail? I want you to make a smart decision based on realistic expectations rather than academic fantasy. We stared at each other across the room, the Harvard acceptance letter lying between us on the coffee table like evidence in a trial where we were arguing different cases. Maya, he said, his voice softer now, I love you. Everything I've built, everything I've worked for, it's all for you. I want you to have security, success, a life where you don't have to worry about money or career prospects. That's what any parent wants for their child. But Dad, I said, tears beginning to form in my eyes, what if security isn't the most important thing? What if there are problems worth risking comfort to address? What if my work could actually make a difference in the world? He walked over and put his hands on my shoulders, looking directly into my eyes. Maya, the world doesn't change because philosophers think about it differently. It changes because engineers build things, because entrepreneurs create companies, because business people solve practical problems. If you want to make a difference, do something that has measurable impact. As I looked at my father, this man who'd worked so hard to build a life of comfort and security for our family, I realized that we weren't just arguing about career choices. We were arguing about fundamental questions of value and meaning, about what constituted a life well lived. The acceptance letter from Harvard represented everything I'd dreamed of, everything I'd worked toward. But it also represented a path that would take me further from my father's world, deeper into a realm he saw as impractical and self-indulgent. That night, I lay awake thinking about the choice ahead of me. I could accept Harvard's offer and pursue the academic career I wanted, knowing that I'd be disappointing the person who'd supported me financially and emotionally through 4 years of undergraduate study. Or I could turn it down and accept his vision of what my life should be, abandoning the work that made me feel most alive. Either way, I was about to disappoint someone I loved. The question was whether I could live with disappointing myself. The spring of my senior year stretched endlessly before me, each day heavy with unresolved tension. I had deferred my response to Harvard until May 1st, giving myself time to navigate the increasingly complex dynamics with my father. The Google internship offered a temporary reprieve, a chance to prove that my philosophical training had practical applications before committing to 6 years of graduate school. My father's reaction to my deferral was predictably pointed. Maya, successful people don't agonize over good opportunities. They either want them or they don't. I want to make the right decision, I replied, not mentioning that his approval still mattered more than I cared to admit. The right decision is the one that sets you up for long-term success. Harvard will still be there if you want to apply again in a few years, after you've had some real-world experience. Dr. Vasquez was less diplomatic when I told her about my hesitation. Maya, I've been teaching for over 2 decades. Students like you, students who get accepted to Harvard's philosophy PhD program with full funding, they don't come along often. You're letting fear make this decision for you. It's not fear, I protested. It's practical considerations. She fixed me with the same penetrating stare she used during Socratic dialogues in class. Whose practical considerations? Yours or your father's? The question haunted me as I prepared for the Google internship. I threw myself into research, reading everything I could find about AI ethics, algorithmic bias, and the philosophical foundations of machine learning. The work was intellectually demanding in a way that felt completely different from traditional philosophy coursework. It required not just theoretical understanding, but practical application to real-world problems. My first day at Google's Chicago office was overwhelming in the best possible way. The building hummed with the kind of creative energy I'd only experienced in the most engaging philosophy seminars. Dr. Amanda Chen met me in the lobby, a woman in her early 40s with short black hair and the kind of confident bearing that suggested she'd never doubted the value of her philosophical training. "Maya, welcome to the chaos," she said with a warm smile. "I hope you're ready to jump into the deep end." She led me through open-plan workspaces filled with people who looked nothing like my stereotype of tech workers. Yes, there were programmers, hunched over multiple monitors, but there were also people who could have been literature professors, economists, psychologists, an interdisciplinary mix that felt more like a university than a corporation. "This is our AI principals team," Amanda explained as we walked. "We've got philosophers, ethicists, computer scientists, policy researchers, even a few anthropologists. The problems we're trying to solve require multiple perspectives." My workspace was in a corner of the floor with floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking the Chicago River. Amanda introduced me to my immediate colleagues, Dr. Marcus Thompson, a philosopher from MIT working on algorithmic fairness, Sarah Kim, a computer scientist developing interpretable AI systems, and David Rodriguez, a policy researcher focused on AI governance. "Maya's thesis work is on consciousness and moral responsibility," Amanda told the group, "which is exactly what we need for the project we're launching." Marcus looked up from his laptop with obvious interest. "What's your take on the hard problem of consciousness as it relates to AI systems?" For the next hour, we had the kind of philosophical discussion I'd dreamed of having in a professional context. We debated whether consciousness was necessary for moral responsibility, how we might detect consciousness in artificial systems, and what ethical frameworks would be appropriate for governing potentially conscious AI. But this wasn't purely theoretical debate. Every question connected to practical concerns. How would Google's AI systems be designed? What safeguards needed to be in place? How could we ensure that powerful AI systems remained aligned with human values? "This is incredible," I said during a coffee break with Amanda. "It's exactly the kind of work I hoped philosophy could do, addressing fundamental questions that have real-world implications." She nodded. 5 years ago, conversations like the one you just had would have been confined to academic conferences. Now they're happening in corporate boardrooms. The technology has advanced to the point where these philosophical questions have become urgent business concerns. That evening, I called my father from my small apartment near Northwestern. For the first time in months, I felt genuinely excited about sharing my work with him. "Dad, you should have seen the office today. It's not what you'd expect from a tech company at all. There are philosophers working alongside computer scientists to solve real problems." "What kind of problems?" he asked, and I could hear genuine curiosity in his voice. "Well, for example, we're working on AI systems that make hiring decisions. But how do we ensure they don't discriminate against certain groups? How do we make sure they're fair?" "Those sound like practical questions," but they require deep thinking about what fairness means, about how moral reasoning works. There was a pause. And companies pay philosophers to think about these questions? They pay philosophers to solve these problems, I corrected. Amanda, my supervisor, she has a PhD in philosophy from Stanford, and she leads a team of 15 researchers. Her work directly influences how Google develops AI systems that affect millions of people. Interesting, he said, and I could hear him processing this information. How much do people in her position make? I had done my research. Senior AI ethics researchers at major tech companies typically make $200,000 to $400,000, depending on experience and impact. The field is growing so rapidly that there's a shortage of qualified people. The conversation was the most positive we'd had about my career prospects in months. For the first time, I felt like my father was beginning to see philosophy as something more than abstract academic indulgence. Over the following weeks, I settled into a routine at Google that felt more engaging than anything I'd experienced in my academic life. My primary project involved developing ethical frameworks for AI systems used in healthcare, work that required deep philosophical thinking about autonomy, beneficence, and justice, but applied to concrete problems like algorithmic diagnosis and treatment recommendations. The work was technically challenging in ways I hadn't anticipated. I needed to understand not just philosophical theories of medical ethics, but how those theories could be translated into computational frameworks. I spent hours with software engineers, learning about machine learning algorithms and how ethical principles could be embedded in code. Maya, your background in Kantian ethics is perfect for this project, Marcus told me during one of our weekly team meetings. We need someone who can think rigorously about categorical imperatives and how they might apply to AI decision-making in healthcare. The project culminated in a presentation to Google's senior leadership about our proposed ethical framework for medical AI. I spent days preparing, knowing that this was my chance to demonstrate the practical value of philosophical thinking to an audience of business executives. The presentation took place in a conference room on the 40th floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of Chicago. Around the table sat VPs, senior engineers, and product managers, the kind of people who made decisions affecting billions of users. I was nervous as I began my presentation, but as I got into the material, I found my rhythm. I explained how different ethical frameworks, utilitarianism, deontological ethics, virtue ethics, could be applied to AI systems in healthcare. I showed how philosophical rigor could help address practical problems like algorithmic bias, patient autonomy, and the distribution of medical resources. The question isn't whether AI systems should make ethical decisions, I concluded. The Yahtzee question is, which ethical framework should guide those decisions, and how we can ensure that our choices are philosophically sound and practically effective. During the Q&A session, the questions were sharp and business-focused, but I felt prepared to answer them. These weren't academics asking about theoretical implications. They were executives asking about implementation, scalability, and measurable impact. Maya, said Jennifer Walsh, a VP of Product Development, this framework is impressive. How quickly could we integrate something like this into our existing healthcare AI products? With the right engineering support, we could have a prototype ready for testing within 6 months, I replied, drawing on weeks of collaboration with the development team. After the presentation, Amanda pulled me aside. That was exceptional work, Maya. You've demonstrated exactly why we need philosophers on teams like this. Are you interested in discussing a full-time position after graduation? My heart leaped. Absolutely. What would that involve? Leading your own research project, managing a small team, and continuing to develop ethical frameworks for AI applications. The starting salary would be $180,000, with significant upside as you develop expertise. That evening, I drove to Winnetka to share the news with my father. For the first time in months, I felt like I had concrete evidence that my chosen field offered real career prospects. I found him in his study, reviewing financial reports from Chen Industries' latest quarterly results. "Dad, I have some exciting news about the Google internship." He looked up from his papers. "How's it going? Are you learning anything useful?" "More than useful. They've offered me a full-time position starting after graduation, $180,000 to start, with opportunities for advancement." His eyebrows rose. $180,000? For a philosophy major? "For an AI ethics researcher," I corrected. "Dad, this is exactly what I've been trying to tell you. The field is real, it's growing, and there are significant career opportunities." He set down his papers, giving me his full attention. "Tell me more about what you'd actually be doing." For the next hour, I described my work at Google in detail. The projects I'd contributed to, the problems I'd helped solve, the frameworks I'd developed. I explained how philosophical thinking was becoming essential for technology companies, grappling with the ethical implications of artificial intelligence. "So you're saying," he said slowly, "that tech companies are hiring philosophers to make sure their AI systems behave ethically. Not just to make sure they behave ethically, but to define what ethical behavior means in specific contexts. It's applied philosophy, using rigorous philosophical thinking to solve practical problems." For the first time in our discussions about my career, I saw something that might have been approval in his expression. "Maya, I'll admit, this is more concrete than I expected. You're not just thinking about abstract questions. You're developing solutions that companies can implement." "Exactly. And Dad, this is just the beginning. As AI becomes more powerful and more widespread, the need for this kind of work is only going to grow." He was quiet for a long moment, studying me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Maya, this Google opportunity sounds promising, but I want you to think carefully about Harvard. You could take this job, gain some real-world experience, and apply to graduate school later if you still want to." The suggestion caught me off guard. After months of dismissing my academic interests, he was now proposing a path that would delay but not eliminate graduate school. "But Dad, Harvard accepted me now. They want me to work with Professor Blackwood, who's doing exactly the kind of research that led to this Google opportunity. If I turn them down, there's no guarantee they'd accept me again in a few years. And if you go to Harvard for 6 years, there's no guarantee that this field will still exist when you graduate. Maya, the business world changes rapidly. Today's hot field can be tomorrow's dead end." The familiar frustration rose in my chest. Even when I provided concrete evidence of career prospects, he found reasons to be skeptical. "Dad, why can't you just be proud of what I've accomplished? I got into Harvard. I've proven that my skills have commercial value. Isn't that enough?" His expression hardened. "Maya, pride is what you feel after someone has achieved something significant. Getting accepted to graduate school isn't an achievement. It's a permission slip to try to achieve something. Getting a job offer is nice, but it's not the same as building a successful career." The words stung more than I expected. "So nothing I do is good enough? Nothing I accomplish matters unless it meets your definition of success?" "Maya, success isn't about meeting my definitions. It's about creating value that other people recognize and reward. It's about building something that lasts." I stood up abruptly, anger and hurt warring in my chest. "You know what, Dad? Maybe your definitions of success are too narrow. Maybe there are kinds of value that can't be measured in quarterly profits." "Maya, no, let me finish. I've spent my entire college career trying to prove to you that philosophy matters, that the work I want to do has value. I've shown you concrete career opportunities, real applications, measurable impact. But it's never enough, because it doesn't fit your worldview." He stood up as well, his own anger beginning to show. "My worldview? Maya, my worldview is based on 30 years of building something real. Your worldview is based on 4 years of college and a summer internship. At least my worldview allows for the possibility that there are different ways to create value, different ways to contribute to the world. Different ways to avoid responsibility, you mean? Maya, at some point, everyone has to grow up and face the practical realities of adult life. You can't stay in school forever, and you can't expect other people to fund your philosophical explorations indefinitely. The accusation hit me like a physical blow. Fund my philosophical explorations? Dad, Harvard is offering me a full fellowship. I wouldn't be taking any money from you. You'd be taking 6 years of your life, he replied coldly. 6 years that you could spend building something real instead of thinking about abstract problems. We stood facing each other across his study, the weight of months of accumulated tension finally erupting into open conflict. I realized that this wasn't just about career choices. It was about fundamental differences in how we saw the world, what we valued, what we thought made life meaningful. Dad, I said, my voice shaking with emotion, I love you, but I can't live my life according to your values. I have to follow my own path, even if you don't understand it. Your path, he said bitterly. Maya, you're 21 years old. You don't have a path. You have interests and preferences and academic encouragement. That's not the same thing. I walked toward the door, then turned back to look at him. Maybe you're right. Maybe I don't know what my path is yet. But I know it's not going to be the one you've chosen for me. As I left his study and drove back to my apartment, I felt something shift inside me. For months, I'd been trying to bridge the gap between my father's values and my own, trying to find ways to make my academic interests align with his practical concerns. But some gaps couldn't be bridged. Some conflicts couldn't be resolved through compromise. The Google internship had given me confidence that my skills had commercial value, that philosophy could be applied to real-world problems in ways that companies would pay for. But it had also shown me something else, that I didn't need my father's approval to pursue meaningful work. The Harvard acceptance letter was still on my desk, waiting for my response. As I looked at it that night, I realized that the decision wasn't really about career prospects or practical considerations. It was about whether I had the courage to choose my own definition of success, even if it meant disappointing the person whose approval I'd always craved. For the first time since receiving the acceptance, I knew what my answer would be. The weeks following my confrontation with my father passed in a strange blur of academic obligations and professional opportunities. I accepted Harvard's offer 3 days before the May 1st deadline, a decision that felt both liberating and terrifying. When I called to inform my father, the conversation was brief and cold. I see, he said after I told him. Well, Maya, you've made your choice. I hope it works out the way you expect it to. The disappointment in his voice was worse than anger would have been. But I pushed forward, focusing on graduation preparations and wrapping up my work at Google. Dr. Amanda Chen was supportive of my decision to pursue graduate school, even as she kept the full-time job offer open. Maya, what you're doing at Harvard will ultimately benefit the entire field, she said during my last week at Google. We need more people with deep philosophical training working on these problems. My graduation ceremony was held on a perfect June day, with Lake Michigan sparkling in the distance beyond Northwestern's campus. My father attended, impeccably dressed as always, but there was a distance between us that felt unbridgeable. During the reception afterward, he made polite conversation with my professors and friends, but I could see the effort it required. Dr. Vasquez pulled me aside as the event was winding down. Maya, I'm incredibly proud of what you've accomplished. Harvard is lucky to have you. Thank you, I said, glancing over at my father, who was standing alone near the parking lot, checking his phone. I just wish that your father understood. She followed my gaze. Maya, sometimes the people who love us most have the hardest time seeing us clearly. Their fears for our future can blind them to our present achievements. That summer, I prepared for my move to Cambridge with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. I found an apartment in Somerville, close enough to Harvard's campus to bike to classes, but far enough away to feel independent. My father helped with the logistics, setting up bank accounts, arranging moving services, but our interactions remained strained. The night before I left for Boston, we had dinner together in the formal dining room where we'd had so many difficult conversations over the past year. The silence stretched between us, broken only by the sound of silverware against china. "Maya," he said finally, setting down his fork, "I know you think I don't support your decisions, but I want you to know that everything I've said comes from love." "I know, Dad." I looked across the table at this man who'd shaped so much of my life, who'd provided everything I'd needed to succeed academically, but who couldn't understand the path that success had led me toward. "I just wish you could trust me to know what's right for my own life." "Trust isn't the issue," he replied. "It's an experience. Maya, you're about to spend 6 years in an environment that will tell you your work is important and groundbreaking. But academic environments aren't the real world. They operate by different rules. Dad, my work at Google this summer was real world enough. The problems I helped solve will affect millions of people." He nodded slowly. "Yes, and that was impressive. But Maya, you're giving up a $180,000 job to go back to being a student. That's not rational by any reasonable measure." The familiar frustration rose in my chest, but I forced myself to remain calm. "It's rational if you believe that the long-term value of the education and research opportunities outweighs the short-term financial cost. If you believe," he repeated. "Maya, successful people don't make major life decisions based on beliefs. They make them based on evidence and careful analysis of likely outcomes." I realized then that we would never agree on this fundamental point. In his worldview, taking risks for abstract rewards was always irrational. In mine, some risks were worth taking if the potential for meaningful contribution was high enough. "Dad, I need you to know that I'm grateful for everything you've given me. The education, the support, the financial security that allowed me to take intellectual risks. But now, I need to use those advantages to pursue what matters most to me." He was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the lake. "Maya, I've built everything I have by being practical, by making decisions that move me closer to concrete goals. I don't know how to support a decision that seems to move you further from practical success." "Then maybe," I said softly, "you don't have to support it. Maybe you just have to accept that it's my decision to make." The next morning, he helped me load my car with boxes of books, clothes, and the few possessions I was taking to Boston. As I prepared to leave, he handed me an envelope. "What's this?" I asked. "A check," he said quietly. "For your first year's living expenses. I know the graduate school stipend won't be much." I stared at the envelope, understanding the gesture. Despite his disapproval of my choices, he was still trying to take care of me. "Dad, I can't take this. You've already done so much. Maya, I may not understand your path, but you're still my daughter. I'm not going to let you struggle financially while you're pursuing it." The drive from Chicago to Boston took 2 days, with an overnight stop in Albany. As the miles passed, I felt the weight of my father's expectations gradually lifting from my shoulders. For the first time in years, I was heading toward something I'd chosen entirely for myself. Harvard's campus in September was everything I'd imagined. Brick buildings covered in ivy, students hurrying across courtyards with armloads of books, the sense of intellectual energy that seemed to radiate from every corner. My first meeting with Professor Blackwood took place in his office in Emerson Hall, a space lined floor to ceiling with philosophy books and papers. Jonathan Blackwood was in his early 50s, with graying hair and the kind of intense focus that suggested a mind constantly engaged with complex problems. Maya, I've been following your work since Elena Vasquez shared your paper on consciousness and moral responsibility. Your approach to bridging philosophical theory with practical applications is exactly what this field needs. Thank you, Professor Blackwood. I'm excited to be here. Tell me about your experience at Google this summer. How did you find working in industry after 4 years of academic philosophy? For the next hour, we discussed my internship, my research interests, and my goals for graduate school. Unlike my conversations with my father, this felt like speaking my native language, a dialogue between people who shared fundamental assumptions about what kinds of questions were worth pursuing. Maya, I want to propose something ambitious for your first year, Professor Blackwood said. We've been awarded a major grant from the National Science Foundation to study the philosophical foundations of artificial intelligence. I'd like you to be the lead graduate student on the project. My heart raced. What would that involve? Developing theoretical frameworks for machine consciousness, moral reasoning in AI systems, and the ethical implications of artificial general intelligence. It's exactly the kind of applied philosophical work you've been doing, but with the resources and time to go deeper. As the semester began, I threw myself into graduate coursework and research with an intensity I'd never experienced. The work was intellectually demanding in ways that pushed me to the limits of my abilities. I spent long nights in the library, wrestling with papers by philosophers whose names I'd known for years, but whose ideas I was finally mature enough to fully engage with. My fellow graduate students were brilliant and ambitious, people who'd turned down lucrative careers to pursue philosophical research. In seminars led by some of the most respected philosophers in the world, we debated questions that felt both ancient and urgently contemporary. But it was the NSF project that truly captured my imagination. Working with Professor Blackwood and a team of graduate students, I began developing what would eventually become known as the Cambridge Framework for AI Consciousness, a rigorous philosophical approach to determining when and how artificial systems might achieve genuine consciousness. The work required mastering technical literature in neuroscience, cognitive psychology, and computer science, then applying philosophical analysis to determine what consciousness might mean in artificial systems. It was exactly the kind of interdisciplinary thinking that my father had dismissed as impractical, but it felt more immediately relevant than any academic work I'd ever done. 3 months into my first semester, I received an unexpected call from Dr. Amanda Chen at Google. Maya, I hope you're settling in well at Harvard, she said. I'm calling because we have an unusual opportunity that might interest you. What kind of opportunity? We're launching a major new research initiative on AI consciousness and moral reasoning. The company is investing $50 million over 5 years to address these questions. We're looking for academic partners, and your work with Professor Blackwood has come up repeatedly in our discussions. My pulse quickened. Are you talking about some kind of collaboration? More than that. We're creating a new position, Director of Philosophical Research, that would involve splitting time between Google and Harvard. The person in this role would lead philosophical research on consciousness and AI ethics while maintaining academic affiliations. The opportunity was almost too good to believe. What would the compensation be? $400,000 annually, plus research funding and the ability to publish freely. Maya, this is a chance to shape how one of the world's most influential technology companies thinks about consciousness and AI ethics. After the call ended, I sat in my apartment in Somerville, staring at my philosophy books and trying to process what I'd just heard. Google wanted to create a position that was perfectly aligned with my research interests and pay me more than twice what senior executives at my father's company made. That evening, I called my father for the first time since arriving at Harvard. When I told him about Google's offer, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. $400,000? He said finally. To do philosophical research? To lead philosophical research on artificial intelligence consciousness, I corrected. Dad, this is exactly what I've been trying to explain. The field is real, it's growing, and there are extraordinary opportunities for people with the right training. Maya? His voice was different now, more thoughtful than dismissive. This is significant. Are you going to take it? I don't know yet. I need to discuss it with Professor Blackwood, and I want to make sure it won't interfere with my graduate work. But Dad, this proves what I've been trying to tell you. Philosophy isn't just abstract theorizing anymore. It's becoming essential for addressing the most important challenges of our time. There was another pause. Maya, I owe you an apology. I clearly underestimated the potential of your field. The words I'd waited years to hear. But instead of triumph, I felt something more complex, a mixture of validation and sadness for the months of conflict that might have been avoided. Dad, I appreciate that, but I need you to understand, this isn't just about proving that philosophy can be profitable. It's about pursuing work that feels meaningful and important. I'm beginning to understand that, he said quietly. Maya, would you be willing to tell me more about what you're working on? I'd like to understand it better. For the first time in months, we had a real conversation about my research, my goals, and my future. He asked intelligent questions about AI consciousness, about the philosophical problems that tech companies were grappling with, about the potential impact of my work. As I hung up the phone that night, I realized that something fundamental had shifted in our relationship. The Google offer had done what months of argument and explanation couldn't. It had made my father see my chosen field as legitimate and valuable. But more importantly, I no longer needed his approval to know that my path was the right one. The work I was doing felt important and meaningful, regardless of external validation. I had found my place in the world, and it was exactly where I'd always known it should be. At the intersection of deep philosophical thinking and urgent practical problems. The real vindication wasn't the money or the prestigious position. It was the knowledge that I had trusted my own judgment, followed my own interests, and created opportunities that aligned with my deepest values. The worthless degree my father had laughed at was opening doors I'd never imagined existed. The Google offer created a whirlwind of possibilities that I hadn't expected to face so early in graduate school. Professor Blackwood was surprisingly enthusiastic when I told him about the opportunity during our weekly meeting in his cluttered office. Maya, this is unprecedented, he said, leaning back in his chair with obvious excitement. Google creating a dedicated position for philosophical research on AI consciousness. It validates everything we've been arguing about the practical importance of our field. But would it interfere with my PhD work? I asked. I don't want to compromise my academic development. He waved a hand dismissively. Quite the opposite. This kind of industry collaboration would enhance your research immeasurably. You'd have access to cutting-edge AI systems, massive computational resources, and real-world testing environments for your theoretical frameworks. Over the following weeks, I found myself in a series of surreal conversations with Google executives about creating a new kind of academic industry partnership. The position they were proposing was unlike anything that existed. Half my time would be spent at Google's research facilities, working with their AI development teams, while the other half would be at Harvard, conducting theoretical research and teaching. Dr. Amanda Chen flew to Boston to meet with me and Professor Blackwood in person. We sat in a conference room at Harvard Science Center, discussing the practical details of what would essentially be a joint appointment between academia and industry. What we're proposing, Amanda explained, is a new model for how philosophers can engage with technology development. Maya would lead a team of researchers focused specifically on the philosophical foundations of AI consciousness and ethics. Professor Blackwood was taking notes furiously. The research funding alone would be transformative. Maya, you could have a team of postdocs, access to the best AI systems in the world, and the ability to test philosophical theories in real computational environments. The conversation felt like science fiction. Here I was, a first-year graduate, student, being offered the chance to lead groundbreaking research at the intersection of philosophy and artificial intelligence. The imposter syndrome was overwhelming. "I need to be honest," I said during a pause in the discussion. 6 months ago, my father thought my philosophy degree was worthless. Now you're offering me a position that would make me one of the highest paid philosophers in the world. It feels surreal. Amanda smiled. "Maya, the field is moving incredibly quickly. The philosophical questions that seemed abstract just a few years ago are becoming urgent, practical problems. Companies like Google need people who can think rigorously about consciousness, moral reasoning, and the nature of intelligence itself." That evening, I called my father from my apartment, looking out at the lights of Cambridge while trying to process the magnitude of what was being offered to me. "Dad, Google has formalized their offer. They want to create a joint appointment between Harvard and their research division. I'd be leading a team of philosophers working on AI consciousness." There was a long pause. "Maya, I need to ask you something, and I want an honest answer. Is this real? Are you really being offered a $400,000 position to do philosophical research?" "It's real, Dad. Professor Blackwood has reviewed all the paperwork. Harvard's administration is enthusiastic about the partnership. This isn't some academic fantasy. It's a concrete opportunity. And you'd be working on what exactly?" I took a deep breath and tried to explain my research in terms he could understand. "Artificial intelligence systems are becoming sophisticated, enough that we need to seriously consider whether they might achieve consciousness. If they do, that raises profound ethical questions about how we treat them, what rights they might have, how we ensure they remain aligned with human values. And this matters to Google because they're developing AI systems that could potentially achieve consciousness within the next decade. They need philosophical frameworks to guide that development responsibly. The decisions made now about how to build AI systems will shape the future of human-machine interaction." For the first time in our conversations about my career, I heard genuine interest in his voice rather than skepticism. "Maya, this is much more concrete than I expected. You're not just thinking about abstract questions, you're helping solve problems that will affect how technology develops." "Exactly. And Dad, this is just the beginning. Other tech companies are starting to hire philosophers for similar roles. The field that you thought was worthless is becoming essential for addressing some of the most important challenges of the 21st century." The next few weeks were a blur of negotiations, paperwork, and logistics. Harvard's administration was eager to formalize the partnership with Google, seeing it as a model for how academic philosophy could engage with pressing real-world problems. The media attention was overwhelming. Articles in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and Wired about the first dedicated philosophical research position at a major technology company. The most surreal moment came when I was invited to give a talk at the World Economic Forum in Davos about the philosophical challenges posed by artificial intelligence. Flying to Switzerland to address world leaders and tech executives about consciousness and AI ethics felt like stepping into someone else's life. Standing on the stage in Davos, looking out at an audience that included CEOs, government ministers, and Nobel laureates, I thought about the conversation with my father 3 years earlier when he'd laughed at my worthless philosophy degree. "The question of machine consciousness," I said to the assembled crowd, "is not just an abstract philosophical puzzle. It's an urgent practical problem that will determine how we build the AI systems that will shape human civilization. We need rigorous, philosophical thinking to guide these decisions." The response was immediate and intense. During the Q&A session, I fielded questions from the CEO of Microsoft about implementing ethical frameworks in AI development, from the Prime Minister of Singapore about regulating potentially conscious AI systems, and from researchers at DeepMind about the philosophical implications of artificial general intelligence. After my talk, I was approached by executives from a dozen major technology companies, all interested in hiring philosophers for similar roles. The field that my father had dismissed as impractical was suddenly in extraordinary demand. But the most meaningful moment came when I called my father from my hotel room that evening. "Maya," he said when I told him about the day, "I watched your talk online. I'm proud of you." The words I'd waited years to hear, but they came with an unexpected complexity of emotions. "Thank you, Dad. That means everything to me." "I owe you a deeper apology than I gave before," he continued. "I was wrong about your field, wrong about its potential, wrong about the opportunities it could create. But more than that, I was wrong to doubt your judgment about your own life." "Dad, let me finish. Maya, I've spent 30 years building a successful business by focusing on practical problems and measurable results. I thought that approach applied to everything. But watching you speak today, seeing the impact of your work, I realize that some of the most important contributions come from people who are willing to pursue questions that seem impractical until suddenly they become essential." I felt tears forming in my eyes. "Dad, I never wanted to prove you wrong. I just wanted to prove that my path had value. You've done that beyond any doubt. Maya, when I think about the impact your work will have, helping shape how artificial intelligence develops, ensuring that these powerful technologies remain aligned with human values, that's more important than anything I've ever accomplished in business." 6 months later, I officially began my joint appointment at Google and Harvard. My first day at Google's research facility in Mountain View was everything I'd dreamed of and more. I had a team of 5 researchers, a budget that dwarfed most university philosophy departments, and access to AI systems that were at the cutting edge of what was possible. My office had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Silicon Valley landscape where so much of the technology that would shape the future was being developed. On my desk was a photo of my graduation from Northwestern, with my father and me smiling together, despite the tension that had defined that period of our lives. Dr. Amanda Chen stopped by during my first week to see how I was settling in. "How does it feel to be leading the world's first dedicated philosophical research team at a major tech company?" she asked. "Overwhelming and exhilarating," I replied honestly. A year ago, I was trying to convince my father that philosophy had practical applications. Now, I'm responsible for developing philosophical frameworks that will influence how AI develops. Maya, what you're doing here will have impact far beyond Google. Other companies are already creating similar positions. You're pioneering a new career path for philosophers. As I settled into my new role, the work proved to be everything I'd hoped for and more challenging than I'd anticipated. My team was developing theoretical frameworks for machine consciousness, but we were also working with engineers to implement these ideas in actual AI systems. The intersection of abstract philosophical thinking and concrete technological development required a kind of intellectual agility I was still learning to master. The breakthrough came 6 months into the position, when our team successfully developed what we called the Consciousness Detection Protocol, a rigorous philosophical and computational framework for determining when an AI system might achieve genuine consciousness. The implications were staggering. If we could reliably detect consciousness in artificial systems, it would revolutionize how we thought about AI rights, ethics, and regulation. The research was published simultaneously in Nature and the Journal of Philosophy, bridging the gap between scientific and philosophical communities in a way that had rarely been achieved. The response was immediate and global: calls from governments asking for policy recommendations, invitations to testify before Congress, and offers from universities around the world for visiting professorships. But the moment that meant the most to me came when my father flew to California to visit me at Google's headquarters. I gave him a tour of our research facility, explained our work in detail, and introduced him to my team. "Maya," he said as we sat in the Google cafeteria, "I need to tell you something. When you were in college, I used to worry that you were wasting your talents on impractical questions. Now I see that you were preparing for the most practical questions of all, the questions that will determine how humanity navigates the future. Dad, you supported me even when you didn't understand what I was doing. That meant everything." He shook his head. "I provided financial support, but I didn't provide emotional support, intellectual support, or faith in your judgment. That was a failure on my part." Looking at my father across the table, I realized that our relationship had been transformed not just by my professional success, but by his willingness to admit when he'd been wrong and to genuinely understand what I was trying to accomplish. "Dad, what you gave me was the security to take intellectual risks. Even when you disapproved of my choices, I knew I had a safety net that allowed me to pursue what mattered most to me. That's a privilege that made everything else possible." As we sat in the heart of Silicon Valley, surrounded by the technology that was reshaping human civilization, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the education that had prepared me for this moment, for the mentors who had believed in me, and for a father who had ultimately learned to see value in a path he'd never understood. The worthless degree had become the foundation for work that was helping to shape the future of human-machine interaction. The impractical questions had become the most practical problems of our time, and the daughter who had disappointed her father by pursuing philosophy had found a way to make ancient wisdom relevant to the newest challenges facing humanity. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.